Chapter 20. While the crowd was attacking the remains of the assassin, 5 officers gathered around the still warm body of Nizam. They were in tears and stretched out their right hands as they mouthed in unison, "Rest in peace, master. None of your enemies will live." But where would they begin? The list of outlaws was long, but Nizam's orders were clear. The 5 men almost had no need to consult each other. They muttered a name and stretched out their hands anew. Then they kneeled down and together raised up the body which had been emaciated by illness but was now weighed down by death, and carried it in a cortege to his quarters. The women had already assembled to wail, and the sight of the cadaver renewed their ululations, arousing the ire of one of the officers. "Do not cry while he is still unavenged." The women were afraid and broke off their crying to look at the man who was already making his way off. Then they started up their noisy lamentations again. The Sultan arrived. He had been with Tarkan when the first cries reached him. A eunuch who had been sent out for the news came back trembling. "It's Nizam al-Mulk, master. A killer jumped on him. He has given you the rest of his life." The Sultan and Sultana exchanged a glance, and then Malik Shah arose. He put on his long cloak of karakul, patted his face in front of his spouse's mirror, and then ran off to see the deceased, feigning surprise and a state of gravest affliction. The women stepped aside to allow him to approach the body of his Ata. He leaned over, uttered a prayer and some appropriate phrases before returning to Tarkan for some discreet celebrations. How curiously Malik Shah behaved. One would have thought that he would have profited from his tutor's disappearance to take complete control over the affairs of his empire, but not so. He was so happy at finally being rid of the man who checked his passions that he frolicked. And there can be no other word for it. Every meeting was cancelled as a matter of course, as was every reception for an ambassador, and the Sultan's days were given over to polo and hunting, while his nights were spent in bouts of drinking. Yet more serious was the fact that upon his arrival in Baghdad, he had sent a message to the Caliph saying, "I intend to make this city my winter capital. The Prince of Believers must decamp post-haste and find another residence." The successor of the Prophet, whose ancestors had been living in Baghdad for 3.5 centuries, requested a month's grace in order to put his affairs in order. Tarkan was worried by this frivolity, which was little worthy of a 37-year-old sovereign who was master of half of the world. But her Malik Shah was what he was, so she let him fool around and took the opportunity this gave her to establish her own authority. It was to her that emirs and dignitaries had recourse, and it was her trusted men who replaced Nizam's acolytes. Between trips and drunken binges, the Sultan gave his agreement. On 18 November 1092, Malik Shah was in the north of Baghdad hunting wild ass in a woody and swampy area. Only one of his previous 12 arrows had missed its target. His companions were singing his praises, and none of them dreamed of matching his feats. The trip had made him hungry, a feeling he expressed in oaths. The slaves set to it. There were a dozen of them brought along to dismember, skewer, and gut the wild beasts which were to be roasted in a clearing. The meatiest leg was for the sovereign, who took hold of it and ripped it to pieces hungrily while treating himself liberally to some fermented liquor. From time to time he munched on fruit preserved in vinegar, which was his favorite dish, and huge vessels of which were carried everywhere Malik Shah went by his cook, so that he would never have to do without. Suddenly he was beset with violent stomach cramps. Malik Shah screamed in pain, and his companions trembled. He threw down his goblet and spat out what he had in his mouth. He was bent double, he threw up everything he had eaten, became delirious, and then fainted. Around him, dozens of courtiers Soldiers and servants trembled as they watched him with disbelief. No one would ever know whose hand slipped the poison into his liquor, or was it in the vinegar or the game. Nonetheless, everyone made their calculations. 35 days had passed since Nizam's death. He had said less than 40, and his avengers were on time. Tarkan Khatun was in the royal camp, an hour away from the scene of the drama. The Sultan was carried into her inanimate but still alive. She hurriedly sent away all onlookers, keeping by her only Jahan and 2 or 3 other trusted courtiers, as well as the court doctor who was holding Malik Shah's hand. "Might the master recover?" the Chinese woman inquired. "His pulse is weakening. God has blown on the candle and it is flickering before going out. Our only hope is prayer." "If such is the will of the Almighty, then listen to what I am going to say." This was not the tone of a widow-to-be, but of the mistress of an empire. "No one outside this yurt must know that the Sultan is no longer with us. Merely say that he is recovering slowly, that he needs to rest, and that no one may see him." What a fleeting and bloody epic was that of Tarkan Khatun. Even before Malik Shah's heart had ceased beating, she demanded her handful of faithful courtiers to swear loyalty to Sultan Mahmud, whose age was 4 years and a few months. Then she sent a messenger to the Caliph to announce the death of her spouse, and to ask him to confirm her son's succession. In exchange, the Prince of Believers would no longer have cause for concern in his capital, and his name would be glorified in the sermons of mosques throughout the empire. When the Sultan's court set off again for Isfahan, Malik Shah had been dead for some days, but the Chinese woman continued to keep the news from the troops. The cadaver was laid out on a large chariot pulled by 6 horses and covered by a tent. However, the charade could not last indefinitely, for a corpse which has not been embalmed cannot linger amongst the living without its decomposition betraying its presence. Tarkan chose to be rid of it, and thus Malik Shah, the revered Sultan, the greatest Shahin Shah, the king of the Orient and the Occident, the pillar of Islam and of the Muslims, the pride of the world and of the religion, the father of conquests, the steadfast support of the Caliph of God, was hastily interred by night at the side of the road in a place which no one has ever been able to find. "Never," said the chroniclers, "has there been told of such a powerful sovereign dying without anyone to pray or weep over his corpse." News of the Sultan's disappearance finally got out, but Tarkan had no trouble justifying her actions. Her first concern had been to hide the news from the enemy, since the army and the court were far from the capital. In fact, the Chinese woman had won the time she needed to place her son on the throne and to take up the reins of power herself. The chronicles of the time make no mistake. When speaking of the imperial troops, they henceforth say the armies of Tarkan Khatun. When speaking of Isfahan, they point out that it is Tarkan's capital city. As for the name of the child Sultan, it would be as good as forgotten, and he would only be remembered as the son of the Chinese woman. The officers of the Nizamiya were nevertheless opposed to the Sultana. Tarkan Khatun was second on their list of outlaws, just after Malik Shah, to whose eldest son, Barki Yarok, had aged 11, they gave their support. They surrounded him, advised him, and led him off to battle. The first skirmishes left them with the advantage, and the Sultana had to fall back on Isfahan, which was soon under siege. Tarkan, however, was not a woman to admit defeat, and to defend herself she was willing to use tricks which would long be famous. For example, to several provincial governors she wrote letters worded as follows: "I am a widow with the care of a minor who needs a father to guide his steps and to steer the empire in his name. Who better than you could fill this role? Come as quickly as possible at the head of your troops Lift the siege, and you will enter Isfahan triumphant. I shall marry you, and you will wield complete power." The argument carried weight, and emirs rushed from Azerbaijan as from Syria, and even though they did not manage to break the siege on the capital, they did provide long months of respite for the Sultana. Terken also re-established contact with Hassan Sabah. "Did I not promise you Nizam al-Mulk's head? I offered it to you. Today I am offering you Isfahan, the capital of the empire. I know that you have many men in this city. Why do they live in the shadows? Tell them to show themselves, and they will obtain gold and arms, and will be able to preach in the open." In fact, after so many years of persecution, hundreds of Ismailis revealed themselves. The number of conversations increased, and in certain quarters they formed armed militias on behalf of the Sultana. However, Terken's last ruse was probably the most ingenious and the most audacious. Emirs from her entourage presented themselves one day at the enemy camp, announcing to Barkiyaro that they had decided to abandon the Sultana, that their troops were on the verge of revolt, and that if he would agree to accompany them and infiltrate the city with them, they could give the signal for an uprising. Terken and her son would be massacred, and Barkiyaro would be able to establish himself firmly on the throne. The year was 1094. The pretender was 13 years old, and the proposition took him in to win control of the city in person when his emirs had been sieging it for over a year. He jumped at the chance. The following night he slipped out of his camp unbeknown to his men, presented himself with Terken's emissaries at the gate of Kahab, which opened for him as if by magic. He walked in decisively, surrounded by an escort which was a little too jolly for his taste, but whose mood he ascribed to the unmitigated success of his exploit. If the man had laughed too loud, he ordered them to calm down, and they responded respectfully before bursting out laughing even more. Alas, when he started to suspect their cheerfulness, it was too late. They pinned him down, bound his hands and feet, gagged and blindfolded him, and led him amid much scoffing to the gate of the harem. The chief eunuch, woken from his sleep, ran off to warn Terken of their arrival. It was up to her to decide the fate of her own son's arrival, whether she should have him strangled or just blinded. The eunuch had disappeared in the long dark corridor when suddenly shouts, cries, and sobs broke out. Intrigued and worried, the officers, who could not hold back from penetrating the forbidden zone, came upon a talkative old servant. Terken Khatun had just been discovered dead in her bed with the instrument of the crime at her side, a large soft cushion with which she had been smothered. A eunuch with sturdy arms had disappeared, and a servant girl remembered that he had been introduced into the harem some years earlier upon Nizam al-Mulk's recommendation. Chapter 21. What a strange dilemma for Terken's followers. Their sultana was dead, but their principal adversary was at their mercy. Their capital was surrounded, but the very person laying the siege was now their prisoner. What should they do with him? Jehan had taken over Terken's place as guardian of the child sultan, and it was to her that the discussion was brought so that she might settle it. Until then, she had shown herself to be extremely resourceful, but her mistress's death had shaken the ground under her feet. To whom could she turn? Whom could she consult if not Umar? Umar arrived to find her seated on Terken's divan at the foot of the drawn curtain, with her head lowered and her dress spread carelessly over her shoulders. The sultan was next to her, dressed all in silk with a turban on his little head. He was sitting on his cushion, his face was red and spotty, and his eyes half closed. He looked bored. Umar went up to Jahan. He took her hand tenderly, stroked her face with his palm, and whispered, "I have just been told about Tarkan Khatun. You have done well to call me to your side." When he caressed her hair, Jahan pushed him away. "If I have summoned you, it is not so that you can console me, but to consult you on a serious matter." Umar took a step backwards, crossed his arms, and listened. Barki Yarok had been caught in a trap and is a prisoner in the palace. The men are divided over the fate that should be meted out to him. Some demand his death, notably those who set the trap. They want to be certain of never having to answer to him for their actions. Others prefer to come to an understanding with him, place him on the throne, and win his favors, hoping that he will forget his misadventure. Still others have suggested keeping him hostage in order to negotiate with the besiegers. Which path do you advise me to follow? You snatched me away from my books to ask me that? Jahan stood up. She was furious. Does the matter not appear sufficiently serious? My life depends on it. The fate of thousands of people, this city and this empire may depend on your decision. Yet you, Umar Khayyam, you do not wish to be disturbed for such a trifle. He went towards the door, and just as he was about to open it, he came back over to Jahan. I am consulted after the crime has been committed. What do you want me to tell your friends now? If I counsel them to release the youth, how could I guarantee that he will not wish to slit their throats tomorrow? If I counsel them to keep him as a hostage or to kill him, I become their accomplice. Leave me out of these quarrels, Jahan, and you too should leave yourself out. He looked at her with compassion. One son of a Turkish sultan replaces another son. A vizier dismisses a vizier. By God, Jahan, how can you spend the best years of your life in this cage of wild animals? Let them rip each other's throats out, kill and die. Will the sun be any less bright or wine any less smooth? Lower your voice, Omar. You are frightening the child. And we can be overheard in the adjoining rooms. Omar persevered. Did you not call to me to ask my opinion? Well, I shall not beat around the bush. Leave this room. Abandon this palace. Do not look back. Do not say goodbye. Do not even collect your belongings. Come, give me your hand and let us go home. You will compose your poems, and I shall observe my stars. Every evening you will come and curl up naked next to me. Wine with the aroma of musk will make us sing, and the world will cease to exist for us. We shall cross it without seeing or hearing it. Neither its mud nor its blood will cleave the soles of our feet. Jahan's eyes were misty. If I could return to that age of innocence, do you think that I would hesitate? However, it is too late. I have gone too far. If Nizam al-Mulk's men take Isfahan tomorrow, they will not spare me. I am on their list of outlaws. I was Nizam's best friend, and I shall protect you. They will not come into my house to make off with my wife. Open your eyes, Omar. You do not know these men. They think only of vengeance. Yesterday they rebuked you for having saved Hassan Sabah's head. Tomorrow they will reproach you for having hidden Jahan, and they will kill you at the same time as me. So we will stay together at home, and if my fate is to die with you, I will resign myself to it. She straightened herself up. I will not resign myself. I am here in this palace, surrounded by troops who are faithful to me, in a city which is now mine, and I shall fight to the end. If I die, it will be as a sultana. And how do sultanas die? Poisoned, smothered, strangled, or in childbirth. Pomp will not help you to escape human misery. They looked at each other in silence for a long time. Jahan drew close to Umar and placed on his lips a kiss which she wanted to be impassioned, and sank into his arms, but he pushed her aside, not able to bear farewells. He begged her one last time, "If you still attach the least value to our love, come with me, Jahan. The table is laid on the terrace. A light wind from the yellow mountains will blow over us, and within hours we will be drunk, and we will go to lie down. I shall tell the servants not to wake us until Isfahan changes master."